HEMA hot take for the day, crossing the feet. If your instinct when you see me do this is that I am automatically off balance, stop and watch this video where we talk about how this might be one of the most misunderstood and underappreciated tools of the medieval martial artist. Deceit, forte swordplay. So today we're going to talk about crossing the feet. One of those topics that I, in the past 20 years, have found is pretty consistently a topic that people seem to have immediate opinions about. One of those opinions is that, oh, that's a position that's bad. And the reason that it's bad is because it puts you into a position where you are off balance, or you can be thrown easily, or you are not mobile, lots of different things. And I think it is worth, it's a great topic to kind of bring up the point about something 20 years ago, we talked about a lot, this idea of frog DNA, where as we were looking the documentation for the German tradition or medieval tradition in general, there's an awful lot of stuff where we're having to fill in holes. In general, the medieval tradition writes instruction very much in terms of examples, rather than some sort of high-level pedagogy, like some sort of like high-level, here are the principles, and therefore this is how you do stuff. Rather, they will put out examples of, okay, here's an example of this technique, or this concept, or that concept. And so, for better or for worse, footwork is one of those things that is spoken fairly rarely about, especially from a overall what are the principles perspective. It's not entirely not spoken of. There are instances where they get into footwork and, you know, an overall framework, which is one of the things we're going to dive into today. That stuff does exist. You got to know where to look for it. But to the point of crossing the feet, again, this opinion that it is automatically bad, I think, is generally spoken from opinions collected from contexts outside of what we're looking at. So for instance, there are definitely Eastern martial arts, or even Western martial arts like boxing in particular, where there's a very strong opinion about, you know, very important to keep good spacing between the feet, both this direction and this direction. And, you know, obviously there's a lot of merit to that kind of idea. That being said, how then do you reconcile the fact that when you look at the medieval tradition, there are plenty of images that show up illustrating the idea of crossing the feet, whether it's this way or this way, a lot of different images from lots of different sources and across different weapons as well. So while I think it's very important to not assume that the frequency that you see something in the historical record suggests how often it was actually being used, I think that's a very dangerous assumption. I think a lower bar on what that means, though, is they knew it existed. It was something that was actually practiced at the time. The question is how much, right? And so that gets to be the tricky thing in terms of interpretation. When do you actually use it? What are the principles that allow that to sort of happen naturally? And, you know, sort of spoiler alert, if you haven't been watching my channel, I think one of the key things to think about is that we're not doing footwork where we are constantly, you know, trying to come to a stopping point where we're even on both feet, but in fact, we're actually using much more walking footwork, in which case crossing the feet, dancing in this kind of manner, is much more organic. So again, we want to make sure that we are not ignoring data that is out there. We want to try to be able to say, okay, if it's illustrated and it's something that they knew how to do and actually did use it for specific techniques, why would they do it? How would they do it? So really, the channel that I have, if you go actually look at some of the more updated fundamentals, we'll get into a lot of that stuff. Also, if you check out the pivotal footwork videos that we have gets into a lot of sort of the physics behind the benefits of that kind of rotation and actually being able to get into those crossed foot kind of positions. But for today, to try to help people understand and make a case for why it's important to explore these crossed foot positions, we're going to turn to a source which, for whatever reason, I think, well, so the source is Joachim Meyer. He wrote a number of things. This late medieval martial arts master wrote a number of documents and historical references in the middle of the 1500s, to the point where actually some of these actually were published. His 1570 work, and in it there is a whole a whole chapter on footwork. He calls it, it's his chapter number 7, stepping for the longsword, and he has longsword as his initial weapon, and then from there he basically goes into other weapon forms, but very much everything that comes later still refers very much to fundamentals that are established in this initial chapter. So we're going to dig into Joachim Meyer in a minute and actually see, what does he say about footwork in general, as well as crossing the feet in particular. So let's move on to that next. Okay, so here we go. I don't usually stand here and kind of read from the sources just because it can be very laboriously, but from that quick view of this translation of Joachim Meyer's 1570 book, chapter 7, advice about stepping, you can see that it's actually a really fairly short chapter, especially like given Meyer, who can be very verbose. That's great. So we can actually read through it, and in addition to reading through it, we're going to actually sort of make commentary as we go. Okay, so so from Joachim Meyer's words himself, translated through the skill of Dr. Jeffrey Forgan, the curator of the Higgins collection. Here we go. Some might here be astonished, and particularly those who are inexperienced in combat, that I offer instruction about stepping. They might believe that nothing much depends on how one steps, or even if something depended on it, that, quote, the market will teach it to you well enough, as the saying goes. But so much depends on this that, as experience shows, all combat happens vainly, no matter how artful it is, if the steps for it are not executed correctly. Therefore, the combat masters of old, who were very learned and experienced in this, stated in their 12 rules. Whoever first steps after the cuts should not rejoice much of his skill. So, a couple of important takeaways there. First, I love the attitude. So he's like, all right, speaking as an experienced person, there are plenty of people who have sort of inexperienced opinions about footwork. And clearly his opinion is footwork matters, right? So you gotta know what you're doing. And in fact, the best way to kind of learn about footwork is actually to use it. Use it in basically the way I would interpret that is like, you gotta go fence, you gotta go actually use it. Okay, great. So he's saying like, footwork's important, the footwork matters, and you have to have experience with it. So what are we talking about? Does he have specifics? I think he might. So here we go. Therefore, each stroke must have its own step, which shall take place at the same time as the stroke, if you wish to achieve anything with the devices you use. For if you step too soon or too late, then it is over with your device, and thus you defeat your own cuts. Therefore, learn to execute the steps correctly so that your opponent cannot proceed with his device as he wishes, but so that you, as it were, steal away the ground or space from him. So immediately, this is something, one of the sort of subtleties about footwork that I've definitely had conversations about in the past 20 years. So if you look at modern Olympic fencing, or which is often used as a basis for rapier theory. The idea that not only am I going to extend the weapon first, but often I'm going to extend, and if I can hit my target even before I land my foot, that is considered a good thing. And for a system where it is very linear and very thrust-centric, that makes a whole lot of sense. That's not what Meyer says, right? And so, again, I think here's an important perspective from an interpreter, which is we don't need to devalue another approach in order to find value in the approach that we're trying to understand. Okay, so if we take him at face value, what does he say? He says, okay, ultimately we want our timing between our stepping and our cuts or our attacks to happen at the same time. From my experience, I think it's not so much the individual cut and foot relationship, but if you're going to be chaining together a whole series of things, it's important to be able to do a blade action for every footwork, every foot step. And you'll notice, like, by doing that sort of thing, yeah, it requires a lot of coordination, but no more coordination than, say, just some sort of dance, right? So, okay. Next, now in the onset, you should act as if you intend to take a big and broad step, but then actually keep your feet close together. And contrarily, when he thinks you will approach him slowly, then be on him swiftly with broad stepping and lay on against him. For so much depends on this that everyone who has learned and practiced combat must acknowledge it. Okay, so again, I think some good specifics there where he's simply saying, okay, so when I'm doing my stuff, there are going to be times where maybe I want to take like a small step, but no, I'm actually going to do a spring, right? I'm going to actually jump or possibly jump high versus wide. Also the idea that I might pretend I'm going to go wide, but then do a small little step. This kind of brings to mind other things that you see in just sports in general. Like I think about things like tennis, where like you might take small steps, but actually then go wide. You see that kind of stuff in football as well. And actually, we'll come to the crossing of the foot issue that I'm kind of focusing on today. But I think the dynamics that you see in sports is something that is very relevant to the way that we could be thinking about the German tradition, particularly Joachim Meyer's dynamic. But I would also argue that like there's no reason that thinking shouldn't apply to the earlier part of the tradition. Meaning that, so as we're doing these kind of actions and we're actually doing it more dance-like, more fluid-like, the ability to do these kinds of side-to-side, fast, wide movements, those become important for things like failures, feints. And if you ever look at someone who's doing football, basketball, or figure skating, right? Like when we're doing this kind of stuff, and there's a lot of rotation that's involved, it makes me sort of smile and laugh a little bit when people are like, oh, but that puts you off balance. Like, I never think about a figure skater or a football player or a basketball player or any of those people, soccer players, as people who are off balance, right? They are in motion though, right? They are not doing things when they're coming to this, right? So, yeah, food for thought. Okay, so we've talked about, hey, you need to practice this stuff. Footwork is important. Hey, try to time your blade actions with your footwork actions and be able to do steps of varying sizes effectively, right? And presumably also change your cadence in order to be able to support that. So now some really, really good stuff. Again, if you've got the opinion that the Germans don't talk about footwork, not true. In addition to the really good general principles that Meyer just talked about. Here we go. Now, there are 3 chief forms of stepping, okay? Firstly, back and forward. It is not necessary to explain at length what these are, namely when one steps toward or away from the opponent. Okay, so in the past 20 years, this is one of the and by the way, I'm going to pick on Meyer, but Meyer is certainly not the only person writing about medieval martial arts or historical martial arts, and trying to explain stuff and pulling the intuitively obvious card, right? There are plenty of other sources that do this exact same thing, and I roll my eyes the same at those. But this is clearly, to me, an example of, oh, this is obvious, so I'm not going to bother explaining it, which really kind of sucks, because for us in our sort of modern mindset, one of the things which I would argue is potentially and likely frog DNA, if we just assume modern Olympic footwork, then you would think, okay, well then, fine. Then these are my steps forward and backward. But is that really what he means? Or could he possibly mean walking? If it's walking, then I can totally understand his perspective of, yeah, like, why do I have to tell you how to walk? Just go forward and backward, right? So that's kind of, so if you think about this idea of like, okay, in HEMA parlance, a lot of people call these half steps versus, or gathered steps, versus passing steps, which, by the way, that language does not exist in the German tradition. Really, it's just steps or half steps. And so the hypothesis that we've been kind of exploring and testing for quite some time now, 20 years, is what if they're talking about this kind of footwork? Simple, walking kind of footwork for back and forth. All right, so let's go with that for a little bit. Let's see if that holds up. Secondly, there are also steps to the sides, which are described by the triangle. Technical term, triangle. Namely thus, stand in a straight line with your right foot before your opponent and step with your left behind your right toward his left. So you're my opponent, this is your right, this is your left. Okay, and what I would say is, if we had a top-down shot, probably be easier to see, but hopefully you can kind of see this on video here. So when he says triangle, my interpretation of that is this, right? So I have 2 points at some point on the ground, even if it's in sequence where I go from here to here and then here, right? From here to here, hopefully you can see that triangle, okay? And this is the single triangle. The other, which is a double step, happens thus. Step as before with your right foot toward his left. So he's starting by saying, okay, I'm doing this, right? This is kind of that first step. Follow then with your left behind the right toward his left, somewhat to the side. And then thirdly, with the right again to his left. Okay, so all of a sudden, what did he call that? Double step. So here's one triangle, here's two triangles. And let's also not forget this very important statement from the very beginning of this section. It started with, secondly, there are also steps to the sides, right? So previous point was, how do you move forward and backward? This kind of passing footwork, if you will, these paces, just walking. In that same way, I'm simply walking sideways, simply walking sideways. And he defines sort of two units. Here's one triangle. And then if I want to complete another action to the other side, second triangle. So, so this is where I invent a little bit of terminology, but to me, this is a backward, a rear triangle, and then this is a forward triangle, okay? Okay, great. So hopefully, regarding, are we doing this kind of footwork as a default as opposed to this kind of footwork as default? Hopefully those two things, to me, suggest that we are actually doing more of this kind of walking footwork, okay? More of this walking dance-like footwork. Okay, and then thirdly, and this third chief form of stepping, this is one that I think is still, to me, there's room for interpretation on this, but again, this is where I'm at. Thirdly, there are the broken or stolen steps, which are done thus. Act as if you intend to step forward with the one foot, and before you set it down, step backwards with it behind the other foot. Since these properly belong in the rapier, I will save it for there. So, yeah, so there may be more in the rapier section, and that's something maybe we'll get to at another time. But what are we talking about with this kind of initial look at these so-called stolen and broken steps? Remember the feinting stuff I was talking about earlier. So if I'm potentially going here, right, you're thinking that I'm going this way. So here's a possible interpretation of that where I go, right? So I started body movement this way, but I'm not overcommitting on my weight on this foot, and I can shift. So I can do things like, so from here to here to here, and you can all of a sudden see these sort of like quick shuffling kinds of movements, which again, kind of circle back to what he was talking about with the broad steps versus the narrow steps, and really these sort of like feinting steps. And even though it's not spoken here, and later on in the longsword section at the very least, probably other sections as well, he talks about things like broken or stolen or actually false steps. Yeah, so all of those actually are, now we're starting to talk about sort of second intention and trying to confuse the opponent in terms of things that they think you're about to do. And that's the end of the chapter. So what are the big takeaways here? Really, this chapter, Meyer is talking about good fundamentals about footwork, right? So, hey, footwork is important. Footwork's important. You're only going to learn this stuff from actually doing it. So actually don't be afraid to explore the stuff if you've been afraid of thinking that this is something that puts you off balance. And in my opinion, like this is where a lot of people with those opinions, this is a great opportunity actually, right? So if you decide that like this is the footwork that you want to do and you want to stay in that lane, fine, go ahead and do that. If, however, you want to explore adding a potential tool to your toolkit, this is how you actually do it. And it's not, okay, I'm going to just stay here in this position and engage, right? Notice that the way that we're actually exploring it is through dynamic movement, dance-like movement. So generally, if I'm going to do this, I'm not stopping here. This is a transition to something else. So, so it's one thing to say that. It's another to actually use it in a sort of like tactically relevant and useful way. And we will get into more of that stuff in a little bit as we look more at Meyer and look at stuff in general across the German tradition. But we will continue to sort of emphasize, hey, there are times when I might want to do this forward triangle or this backward triangle and see what the benefit is. So yeah, so do the fencing, the footwork, do it with experience, make sure you practice it. Make sure that every stroke has its own step. Try to time your attacks and your steps together so that these things can flow. Make sure that you're taking small or big steps as appropriate. And then make sure you can move forward and backward, sideways, and probably doing it with this more walking dynamic. And then once you're good with that, start playing with the cadence and actually do things where you're pretending to go one way and then switch your feet so they can go the other direction. That's it. Meyer. Joachim Meyer, since there's another Meyer, Paul Hector Meyer, but Joachim Meyer, 1570, Chapter 7, Advice About Stepping. So that's it for today. Hopefully, if you've had thoughts about crossing the feet, this gives you more food for thought. And, you know, I can't say anything other than, you know, try it. You might like it. Okay? See you next time.